We are in Matthew chapter 26. And Cindy, don't let me forget at the end of class, I got your reading plan. I actually got one for both of y'all. I didn't know if you wanted two or one, but don't let me forget that. So Matthew chapter 26, we wrapped up 25 last week. And this gets us headed toward Jesus' betrayal and arrest. In fact, as we have been doing, we will break down the chapter with kind of a section by section summary. So the first two verses of chapter 26, Jesus again predicts his betrayal and his crucifixion. Verses 3 through 5, you have the Sanhedrin. They make plans to kill Jesus, but they decide they're going to wait and do this after the Passover because they fear the people. We'll see when we get there. 6 through 13, verses 6 through 13 of chapter 26, Mary of Bethany anoints Jesus. 14 through 16, Judas agrees to betray Jesus to the Jewish leaders, covenants with them for 30 pieces of silver. 17 through 25, Jesus eats the Passover meal with his apostles. 26 through 29, Jesus establishes the Lord's Supper. Verses 30 through 35, Jesus predicts Peter's denying him 3 times, and also the other apostles being offended at him. 36 through 46, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. 47 through 56, Judas betrays Jesus, bringing a group of the Jewish leaders, to take Jesus. 57 through 68 is Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin questioning Jesus. And then 69 through 75, just as Jesus predicted, Peter denies him 3 times. So you can tell it's a long chapter, and there's a lot going on in this chapter. So let's dive right in and look at these first couple of verses where Jesus again predicts his betrayal and his crucifixion. Remember with the end of chapter 25, you have the end of what we sometimes call the Olivet Discourse. Jesus has been talking to his apostles there. This is not one of those occasions where he's speaking to a massive crowd. He's speaking just to them. They leave the temple in the beginning there of chapter 24. And so you have, at that point, he begins to address them. He talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. He talks about the end of time, and then in chapter 25 he gives these 3, at least 2 parables and 1 depiction of the judgment scene there, talking about what it's going to be like at the end of time and what Jesus' disciples are supposed to be doing as we await his return. Now, it says here, it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings. So obviously that's the end of what we call the Olivet Discourse. So he says to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days is the feast of the Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified." Now, bear this in mind because this will come into play in just a moment. 2 days before Passover. And of course, when you get to John 13, there's a synoptic account, a parallel account, and John will say 6 days before Passover. So we're going to talk about that, of course, when we get there. But he says here, Jesus says, "You know that after 2 days is the feast of the Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified." So Jesus again predicts, of course he had previously predicted his betrayal and or death. Chapter 16, remember in chapter 16 when he predicted his death, Peter says, "No way, this isn't going to happen. We're not going to allow that." And of course Jesus' response to that was what? "Get thee behind me, Satan." That was something that Satan would have loved for Jesus not to have gone to the cross. He also predicted it in chapter 17, 22, and 23, which is coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, as you recall. And then also in chapter 20, 18, and 19. By the way, the only recorded predictions Jesus made about these things would be to his apostles. Only to his apostles. With the exception, I would say, of John chapter 2, but they don't know what he's talking about. So I guess we could say, let me check my reference on the verse. For some reason, verse 19 came into my mind, and I don't know if that's going to be the right verse or not. Sometimes a verse just pops into my head, and sometimes it's right, and sometimes it's not. It was right. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So there, Jesus makes a statement to some of his opposers. Well, you destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They think he's talking about the physical temple. And of course, they even, say 40 and 6 years was the temple and building. You're going to rear it up in 3 days? They didn't get that he was talking about the temple of his body. So if you want to count that one, that would be the only one that I'm aware of that was not spoken just to his apostles. So going on into verse 3, then assembled together the chief priests, scribes, elders of the people, unto the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. But, they said, not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar among the people. Oh, the irony. The goal of the Jewish leaders here is plain. They want Jesus dead. They want him gone. On a few occasions previous to this, they had wanted to kill him, but his hour, his time had not yet come. There's an occasions mentioned, Mark 3:6, John 5 is another one, John 8. They really wanted him. I mean, they were worked up into a near frenzy in John 8. Luke 4, there's another account when he talks. I mean, he got them really riled up, and it's kind of a sad commentary on their hearts. And these were some of what were supposed to be the spiritual leaders. And in Luke 4, what had them so riled up was that Jesus says, there were many widows in the time of Elijah, but do you know where Elijah was sent? To a Gentile widow. There were a lot of lepers in the time of Elisha, but do you know who was healed? A Gentile leper named Naaman. And they were furious. And they decided they were just going to take him to the brow of the hill and just throw him off. But of course, he passed through. John 10 is another example. Over and over again. This isn't the first time that they've wanted to kill him. Now they're starting to formulate a concrete plan, though. And they say, not on the feast day. We later find out in Matthew 27, their motive for wanting to kill Jesus is what? Envy. We might say jealousy. Jealousy and envy, I think, are pretty synonymous terms, but maybe we might say there's a subtle difference. What would that be?
Envy seems to carry the concept of you wanting something that somebody else already had. And what Jesus had was the following of people, and they feared that would continue to grow and would threaten their time.
Yeah, if you pull up with a new car, I might say, "Whoa, man, I like that. I'm jealous of that car, man. That's pretty sharp." That's as long as we keep that in its proper place. There's nothing wrong with admiring something somebody else has. So that's nice. I'd like to have that. But if it gets to the point of envy, it's like, not only do I like it, not only do I want it, if I had half a chance and I can get away with it, I'd take it from you. And if that means killing you, if that means just stealing it, whatever. And that's kind of, again, I think they're pretty synonymous terms, but if we had to put our finger on a significant difference in the terms, that would be it. It's one thing to be, of course, jealousy, you may recall from our study last year of the works of the flesh, jealousies being one of those. It's a word from zelos in the Greek, and it's something that can be good or bad. You can be zealous, that's the same word, for good things, or you can be zealous for bad things. You can be jealous in a good way. God is a jealous God, you recall from several times in the Old Testament, and even in the New. But then there's jealousy in a bad way of, coveting something that somebody else has. But envy really takes it to the next level. I mean, it's not only do I want it, an inordinate desire for it, give me half a chance, I'll take it away from you. And that's the idea. And, as Tim pointed out, what does Jesus have that they're so jealous of? Well, he has a following. He has a great deal of respect. I think they also see that he has power, and they're jealous of that. They'll never get that power because they'll never be God in the flesh, and they know that good and well. But they still are so envious of him. And instead of rightly acknowledging that this is the Son of God, their solution is, well, let's just kill him. And it never ceases to amaze me when I study this, just the attitude that they have. But it's also ironic because in Matthew 27, even an outsider, a Gentile, a pagan, recognizes this. Who was that? Pilate. Pilate knew. It says he knew that for envy they had delivered him. That's kind of ironic in itself, isn't it? And of course, they're willing to use any method necessary to kill Jesus. They're going to talk about here in verse 4, they consult how they might take him by subtlety. Now, we're going to have to do this on the down low, y'all. We all agree we want him dead, right? But we can't just do this out in the open. I'm going to tell you something. Anytime secret, clandestine meetings are going on and things like that, that ought to be a red flag. Something is not right. I've seen it happen in secular business type situations. I've seen it happen in churches, secret meetings going on, and maybe the elders aren't invited to that meeting, or some of the elders are invited and some are not, things like that. When there's that kind of shady business going on, nothing good comes from that. There's nothing good behind that. And so they know what they're doing is not right. So they say, look, we got to do this subtly. We got to be sneaky about this. So that's what they decide they're going to do. And in fact, of course, later on, when you get to verse 59 of this chapter, we won't get that far tonight, I'm sure, but when you get to verse 59, they're even going to go so far as to hire false witnesses. And you know what's ironic about that? Even though they hire false witnesses, they still can't get their stories to agree. Don't you know that just incensed those leaders? Like they're kind of, over here wanting to just scream out, but they can't because then the people would hear. But they're probably wanting to scream, we paid you guys to say, and you're not saying it right. Maybe they didn't have enough time to rehearse their lines. I don't know. But they said, not on the feast day, verse 5, lest there be an uproar among the people. So they didn't want to kill him during the Passover feast. They don't want this uproar among the people. And again, it's ironic because they fear the people, but ultimately, who do they not fear? God. They're more afraid of the people. It's kind of like John 12, 42 and 43. They love the praise of men more than the praise of God. Here are people that are more afraid of humans than they are of God himself. And so they decide they're going to wait until after Passover. Now, when you get to verses 6 through 13, you have this anointing of Jesus with ointment. When Jesus was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, there came unto him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, poured it on his head as he sat at meat. When his disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, to what purpose is this waste? For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor. When Jesus understood it, he said unto them, why trouble ye the woman? For she hath wrought a good work upon me. For ye have the poor always with you, but me ye have not always. For in that she hath poured this ointment on my body, she did it for my burial. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached in the whole world, there shall also this that this woman hath done be told for a memorial of her. So, I mentioned this just a moment ago. From John's account, it appears that this took place when Jesus came to Bethany 6 days before Passover. And if you go back to verse 2, you're like, wait a minute. Jesus says, after 2 days is the feast of Passover. And so what gives there? Well, bear this in mind, a couple of different things to remember here. Number one, Matthew and Mark did not always relate events in the exact order they occurred. In fact, quite often, I don't know if I'd say quite often, but at least often, they did not. relate things in the actual order that they occurred. Number two, Matthew and Mark, they don't affirm what time this is. They don't say when exactly this is. Jesus is making a statement that's recorded there in verse 2, but they don't say when this is. This is a different, again, sometimes they didn't tell things in the exact order they occurred, so they may have, maybe that Matthew's relating the plot to kill Jesus, and he makes that statement that he makes there in verse 2, yes, 2 days before Passover. But now Matthew backs up to 6 days before the Passover and says, well, Jesus was in Bethany. And we do that sometimes. It depends on the person. I sometimes will do that. I'll sometimes be telling something and I get sidetracked, rabbit trail, whatever, and I may just come back and I may just pick up where I left off. And sometimes I'm talking to people and they're like, wait, what? What are you talking about? I'm like, well, earlier we were talking about, and they're like, oh, yeah, well, I forgot about that. But okay, now go ahead. I know what you're talking about. And sometimes we do that. Other people they got to keep like a linear flow. Just depends on people. And sometimes you think of something and you say now hold pause right there. It was 6 days before Passover when Jesus was in Bethany. Let me tell you about what happened then. Now, why on earth would Matthew do that? For one thing, again, it may just be a personality thing. The Holy Spirit used the individual personalities of these writers, but it would seem, again, we don't have anything to tell us definitively, but it certainly would make sense. The most logical reason is Matthew is introducing Judas' betrayal. So it makes sense to back up a little bit, and he's going to give us kind of some background here. He's going to connect this account of Judas and his betrayal of Jesus. So he's going to talk about Mary anointing Jesus, the disciples. Boy, they're really indignant. Of course, John's even going to tell us more specifically, Judas sort of led the way with the indignation. And they may have played off his lead, not to excuse their behavior, but he did definitely take the lead there. And then he goes right from that into verse 14. One of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priests. So that makes sense. But this is not the first time, not the only time that Matthew tells things that are not in the exact order they occurred. He never says that's what he's doing. He doesn't say this is the exact order that it happens. And so it seems like he's backing up a little bit here to give us some context behind Judas and his betrayal. Obviously, this is not something that just happened right upon that event, but maybe that's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, as we say, in Judas' mind, and maybe he's thinking, I've had it. Jesus, he's not overthrowing the Romans. He's not establishing an earthly kingdom. In fact, when, think back to John chapter 6, when we tried to make him an earthly king, he just got out of there and goes up into a mountain to pray. And now, here's this ointment, spikenard or nard or something like that, and they would have these little bottles. It probably would have been, if you've ever been to the Biblical History Center down there in LaGrange, you've seen one of these. Something, just 2 or 3 inches tall, little bitty, small flask. And it's not here, is it? Let's just, you may want to turn over to John 13. Because that's this parallel where John gives us a little more information than the other writers do. Not 13, 12. Sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself thinking about the predictions of betrayal and forsaken by the apostles. And it's verse 3, it mentions a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly. And then you have verse 5, which verse 4 tells us is Judas. Verse 5, why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence? Anybody got a New King James? Denarii. Denarius, and given to the poor. Now, to put that in context, a day's wage for a Jew typically was a denarius. So you take out Sabbaths, Jewish holidays, feast days, and a yearly salary for your average working man Jew was 300 denarii. This was a year's salary. And Mary just broke it open. Again, if you've ever seen one of those, we've like I said, some of you guys have been at the Biblical History Center and you've seen one of those. It almost looks like a little miniature flask. And what they would do many times is it would be kind of a wax type seal over it. But there's no real way to reseal that. In other words, when you open it, you open it. Or sometimes it would even be, and in fact that may be the case here, sometimes they would just actually seal it shut. And there's no way, in fact, it's Mark's account, I'm almost positive. Mark's account in Mark 14 will record her as having broken it. It's not in John's, is it? Somebody check me there. No. All right, so Mark 14. Some of these events are recorded in 3 different gospel accounts, and it gets hard to keep up with all the pages. So, let's see, it's verse 3 of Mark 14. Having an alabaster box of ointment of spikenard, very precious, box being some type of a flask or something like that, or it could have been a box, but a lot of times they would seal these up so that the only way you're going to get into it is you break it. It'd be some kind of a clay or something like that, and you just, once it's open, it's open. And that's another thing. Sometimes people say, I think it's actually from Mark's account, it's not Mark's account. Anyway, one of the accounts, it's not Matthew's, is it? I'm probably reading past it. Where he says, it's just the way it's worded now, never fails when you're looking for something. You just look right past it. She has come beforehand and anoint my body to the burying. I'm in Mark 14 now, verse 9. That's not it. I was just looking at it like an hour ago. Oh, I think I'm thinking of John 12:7. Let her alone against the day of my burying hath she kept this. Some people had the idea that like some of it was kept and saved later for when Jesus actually did die to anoint his body. Well, that wouldn't even be feasible with these boxes when you understand how those things were made and the whether it was a little flask type thing or an actual box as we think of it. It wouldn't work that way. Once you open it, you've broken it open, and there it is. And there's no need to suppose that anyways from the way that's worded, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But all that just to say, you could see Judas, things probably have been building in Judas' mind. At some point, he's become infiltrated. His mind has become infiltrated by worldliness. He probably is thinking Jesus should have established a kingdom on earth, like a lot of folks had that misconception. He's wondering why Jesus doesn't overthrow the Romans, and maybe now all of a sudden here's Mary, and she just broke open this. Put it in our context. I don't know, what is an average salary now? About $1 a day. Man, Carson, you might need to seek employment elsewhere. Okay.
The account shows that Judas is the one who called Jesus out.
Yes.
And it's kind of interesting that they call it Judas who also leads them.
Well, yeah, he leads the way. And
Is he the money handler for the group? Did I read that somewhere?
yes, that's in John's account. he was a thief and held the bag. And so, apparently he was dipping into the money. And you could just see Judas going like, here's 20, 30, 40,000, I don't know, whatever an average salary is, putting it in our term now, like $30,000. And she just, in Judas' mind, he's probably thinking, she just threw it away. She just threw it away. Now, of course, somebody who doesn't see Jesus as he ought to see him views that as a waste. But can you imagine? I mean, could you imagine, men, you buy something for your wife. Maybe she loves flowers. And so, going to get her a dozen roses. And somebody may say, what a waste. What a waste. I mean, those flowers in a few days, they're going to wilt. They're going to die. That's just a waste. But is it a waste to you? You're honoring your bride. You're honoring somebody that means the world to you. That's not a waste. Anything you can do to show love for somebody that you care about, that's not a waste. So, but to Judas, he just sees it as, wow, you're just throwing money away. Might as well just light it on fire, as we say in our time, and burn it up. So maybe that's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't know, but I think that's probably why Matthew backtracks a little bit to insert this here, even though it was occurring a few days before what he started the chapter with. This occurs in the home of Simon the leper, he says there in verse 6. Don't confuse this, by the way, with an earlier occasion when what is referenced just simply as a sinner, we're not told who anointed Jesus in the home of Simon a Pharisee. It's a different Simon, Luke 7:36 through 50. It's much earlier in the life and the ministry of Jesus. Most likely this particular Simon, Simon the leper, I think it's almost certain he's no longer a leper. Probably, most likely, he would have been healed by Jesus. And probably because of that, his having been healed by Jesus, somebody kind of started nicknaming him Simon the leper. Well, he's not a leper anymore, but he was Simon the leper. One commentator, and I apologize, I don't remember who, or I'd give credit. One commentator, because I actually just ran across this afternoon, made the statement that this may very well be a family member of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, because John's account, it doesn't come out and say this is in their home, but it does say Martha served, and it would make most sense. It's not that she couldn't serve in somebody else's home, but typically, if she's serving, it's probably because she's hosting, right? So it may be that Simon is a close relative of theirs, and maybe even that he lived there with them. Some of this, again, we get into speculation, and just bear that in mind. I'm not trying to tell you exactly how it was because we don't know, but we're just trying to say these may be likely explanations. But from the book of John, as we mentioned, we're given some additional information. Lazarus, already having been raised from the dead, he's present. Whether it's at their house or not, we don't know for sure, but we do know for sure Lazarus is there. John's account in John 12 tells us that. We also know Martha was there and that she was serving. And we know Mary was there, and she is mentioned as the one who anoints Jesus. Because in Matthew's account, she is not, I got so many accounts running together in my head now. In Matthew's account, she's not named. But we know from John's account that it was Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who actually did the anointing of Jesus. We know also from John's account, as mentioned a couple of different times here, Judas is the one who first complained and possibly, I might even say likely, influenced the other apostles to complain. He wasn't really concerned for the poor. He was a thief and held the bag, John 12:6. As far as Mary's anointing of Jesus, when some of them complained, Jesus said, according to Mark 14:6, what did he say? Does anybody remember that? Let her alone. That shows Jesus approved and accepted her action. In fact, he even calls, here in Matthew's account, in verse 10, what does he call it? Verse 10. A good work. He says she wrought a good work on me. Leave her alone. He said there'll always be poor people, and we can always do good to them, Mark 14:7. But Mary has anointed Jesus for his burial. And interestingly, she's anointed him for his burial before his death instead of afterwards. Typical Jewish custom, obviously, was you anoint somebody after their death. He also says what she did would be spoken of as a memorial whenever, wherever the gospel would be preached, verse 13. And indirectly, Jesus shows the gospel will be preached, carried into all the world. Here's the question that sometimes comes up, and again, we're going to have to do the best we can on this because I don't think we can say for sure. I think we can say probably likely, if I may be so bold as to say that. But the question is this: did Mary know that Jesus was going to die soon? And it's interesting because you could study different commentators will take different positions on this. And again, I don't know if I could say dogmatically, but I think it doesn't make the most sense to me that she knew. How would she know? There's no indication Jesus had told her. Now, there's nothing that says he had not told her. So it's possible. But every other time when he mentions his death, he's talking to his apostles. Even they, though, they don't know when. Now, if they had put two and two together, they might have figured that it was imminent because he kept talking about in Jerusalem. We've got to go to Jerusalem. Son of Man's going to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. So, but there's no indication that anybody but the apostles had been told those things. They don't know when it's going to happen. Even with the two and two together, in Jerusalem, they didn't put two and two together for whatever reason. And I kind of chuckle when I say that, but it's easy for us to look, hindsight's 20/20. We're looking at a historical account. It's easy for us to look at it and go, come on, guys, get it together. How did you not figure that out? But probably if we'd been in their shoes, we'd have had the same difficulties. I think it's doubtful that she knew he was going to die. A.T. Robertson was one that I read just as recent as this afternoon. He took the position she knew. What a blessed knowledge she'd been blessed with by the Lord that she knew he was about to die. I don't know. It just seems that seems pretty speculative to me. I like what Jamieson Fawcett Brown commentary says. Quote, "Not that she thought of his burial, much less reserved any of her nard to anoint her dead Lord." Remember we talked about that. Once it's broken open, there's no, well, I'm going to save some of this for later. But, it goes on to say, as the time was so near at hand when that office would have to be performed, and she was not to have that privilege, even after the spices were brought for the purpose. Remember Mark 16:1? They came with what? With spices to anoint the body. They had waited because, why didn't they just do it when Jesus died before, right immediately after he died? They didn't have time. Why? The Passover, the Sabbath is approaching. And the Jews understood you rest on the Sabbath. So that's what the women did. They were faithful Jews. They rested on the Sabbath, and they came early on the first day of the morning as it's just beginning to get daylight, and they've got their spices in hand, and they're having a conversation. By the way, what's their conversation about? Yeah, ladies, here we are, dainty Jewish women. How are we going to roll that? Those stones sometimes would weigh upwards of 2,000 pounds. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that they're typically on an incline? And the closed position, or the open position, is going up the incline. That makes it harder for grave robbers and critters and things like that. So they're having this conversation. Well, they get there, and of course, oh, look, the tomb's open. Wait a minute. He's not in there. So she didn't get to anoint his body, even when she came for that purpose. So, getting back to this quote, as the time was so near at hand when that office would have to be performed, and she was not to have that privilege even after the spices were brought for the purpose, Mark 16:1, he lovingly regards it as done now. I think that makes the most sense. I don't think she's going, well, I know Jesus is about to die. And she sure isn't going, well, I know he's about to die and he's going to be resurrected when I get there on Sunday morning, so I've got to go ahead and anoint his body now. No, there's no way. Did she know he was about to die? I can't say that for sure. I think I could say with a high degree of probability, no, she didn't know that. But I can definitely tell you she didn't know that she's going to get there on Sunday morning and the tomb's empty. Yes, sir.
Maybe you can think if she did know anything, perhaps it might have been women's intuition. That's the only thing that I can think to.
Perhaps. Chris said maybe if she happened to know anything at all, maybe just what we sometimes say, woman's intuition. She knows, and no doubt Jesus probably had a very somber difference in his demeanor at this time. So that could be. And
Chad, would this ointment that she used, would that be a typical honor that would be presented or given to somebody or poured on somebody at any other occasion other than at their death?
I'd have to research that a little bit. Robert asked, is the ointment or the nard that is mentioned here something that would be used at any occasion other than death? I think so. Not just any old occasion, obviously, because it's very expensive. But I don't think it'd be reserved just for like a funeral anointing of the body. Yeah, that's the best I can say on that. I was just trying to think if I could draw on anything else, and I can't think of anything. But help me remember that. I need to look into that because that's a good question. I don't have a pen on me. Thanks, sir. She does seem kind of insightful, perceptive. Yeah, Mary is a very perceptive person, and she spent a lot of time with Jesus. I mean, she's there at the cross when he dies. She's there first thing Sunday morning to bring spices, not knowing, of course, that he was risen from the dead. All right, I'm going to write that down, Robert. Sorry, I can't talk and write at the same time, so I'm just going to. Y'all know I can't multitask. Thank you, Chris. I'm gonna check that out and see, because that would probably offer us some insight, at least, you know. So, but I do think the Jamieson Fawcett Brown commentary quote sheds some light on that. If she didn't know, because sometimes people say, well, okay, if she didn't know, why is she doing this? Why did Jesus make that statement? I think that fills in the gap on that. So that brings us to verses 14 through 16. Judas agrees to betray Jesus to the Jewish leaders, and he agrees with them for 30 pieces of silver. 14, then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priests and said unto them, what will you give me, and I will deliver him unto you? They covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver, and from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. Well, when Judas unexpectedly, the Jewish leaders didn't know this was coming. They didn't see this coming. And he unexpectedly makes an offer, I'll betray him. What will you give me? So, makes you wonder, with Judas, it kind of almost seems like it's just coming down to money, right? But they make this offer, Judas makes this offer rather, and so now they alter their plan. They had agreed, remember, to wait until after Passover? We'll kill him after Passover. Don't want an uproar of the people. Well, now, wait a minute. Now one of his own's coming to us, and we can probably take him in secrecy. We can do this subtly without an uproar of the people. The prophecy of this betrayal price, 30 pieces of silver, is recorded, by the way, in Zechariah 11, verse 12. And it's named 30 pieces of silver. Listen, people sometimes talk about, prophecy and want to. If you just pinned me down and said the one most definite, or I don't know about definite, the greatest evidence of Bible inspiration, you say, what is that? If you made me just pick one thing, it would be prophecy. You just can't explain it any other way. And sometimes people will try to sort of, oh, come on, Chad, Jesus could have read, or the apostles, the disciples could have read that, oh, the Messiah is going to come riding into Jerusalem on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so they could have just set him on a donkey and had him ride into Jerusalem just to fulfill the prophecy, fulfill the prophecy. But listen to me, folks. These aren't Jesus' friends here. This is Judas, who goes and says, I'm kind of fed up. If you guys are willing to offer some money, maybe we can make a deal. And they decide on the exact amount that was. Now look, these guys they hate Jesus. The last thing they want is for him to fulfill any prophecy. They don't go, well, in Zechariah 11:12 it says 30 pieces of silver, so why don't we settle on that? Now, 30 pieces of silver was, what do we often point out about that price? Price of a common slave. I think there's probably a reason that they named that price. That's probably about what Jesus was worth to them. Isn't that pitiful? Yeah, it is. And no doubt, again, it's not one of those things I can say dogmatically, but makes me think they knew exactly what they were doing when they named that price. Oh, yeah. 30 pieces of silver, that's all we'll give you for this fella. They want to insult him. So that's recorded in Zechariah 11:12. That's just one prophecy of over 300 in the Old Testament fulfilled in Jesus. I've mentioned this several times before, but it is worth mentioning quickly here. What's the guy's name? Peter Stoner, it's like a statistician by trade. He has a book. Oh man, the name of the book escaped me. But anyways, he's big into figuring stats and things like that. And he decided to look statistically. What are the odds that one person fulfills 8? I don't know why he picked 8, but 8 prophecies. Exact fulfillment of 8 of those prophecies from the Old Testament about the Messiah. And he came up with, statistically, the probability was something like 1 in 10 to I think it's the 17th power, 19th power. And he likened it to, he said, to get kind of an idea, an everyday type illustration. It's not very everyday about it, I guess, but a more concrete illustration for us. He said, picture covering the state of Texas with silver dollars. 2 feet deep, or a foot deep. Silver dollars, the entire state of Texas, a foot deep. One of those silver dollars is marked with a red X. It's buried somewhere in there. You get a man, blindfold him, he wanders over the state of Texas for a day or so, and then at some point you say, okay, stop, now reach down and grab one. And he pulls it up and goes, oh, I got it. He said, those are your same chances. That's 8. 8 of the prophecies. There are over 300, all fulfilled in Jesus. That's why I say, if you pinned me down and said, give me one reason, only one reason to believe the Bible, and I would say prophecy. You cannot explain it from just a human standpoint. Psalm 41:9, by the way, also predicted that Jesus would be betrayed by a friend. Verses 17 through 25, Jesus is going to eat the Passover meal with his apostles. This, of course, was to be eaten as a memorial on the 14th day of the first month. That was established in Exodus. It's a memorial of how God spared Israel's firstborn in Egypt, even though the Egyptian firstborn children were slain. All leaven is to be removed from their homes until the evening of the 21st day. That additional week, by the way, is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Jesus kept the law of Moses perfectly, so of course he observed the Passover. There are earlier Passovers in Jesus' life. In fact, that's how we date the ministry of Jesus. There's one in John 5, verse 1. There's a feast that we don't know for sure if it's the Passover. I think there's pretty conclusive evidence that it is. If it is, Jesus' ministry was about 3.5 years. And of course, most scholars believe that it is. If it wasn't, then Jesus' ministry was about 2.5 years. The disciples who go and prepare the Passover were Peter and John. We're told that in Luke's account, Luke 22. It appears that they ate the Passover on a Thursday evening according to our time, which will be Friday by the Jewish time because of the sun going down. I just lost my place. I was trying to wrap up real quickly. I don't want to end in the middle of a section. Jesus had told them before that he'd be betrayed, but this is the first time he told them that one of them would be the betrayer. And what a shock. Don't you know that must have been to them? This is the first time he says, one of you is going to betray me. And all the apostles, even Judas acting as a hypocrite, start asking, well, who is it? Is it me? Is it I, Lord? What Judas did was so horrible. Jesus said in 26:24, it had been better for him not to have been born. He willingly committed this awful sin. And from John's account in John 13:23 through 26, only John was told exactly who would betray Jesus, that it was Judas. The others don't know. They don't know why Judas leaves. And so what you have in John's account is Peter motions to Jesus when Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And Peter says to John, hey, ask him. And so he does. And Jesus then says, he who dips in the dish with me. And he probably Jesus, John, and Judas were sharing that dish. And then Judas does that. Jesus says, that thou doest, do quickly. And he leaves. So John, Jesus, and Judas are the only ones that know at that point. All right, let's stop there. And Lord willing, we'll pick up next Wednesday, verses 26 through 29, Jesus establishing the Lord's Supper. Thank y'all very much.